developed a storyline for Shadow Man. He comes back at predetermined moments through the game. There's one point where he steals a potion. Just as you're about to reach it, Shadow Man comes running in, drinks it, and runs off. There's another moment where you're about to get through a gate. Shadow Man walks up, steps on the pressure plate, and closes the gate. At that point, you fall back down 3 levels, and you're going to have to work your way back up. These encounters were scripted to make you hate Shadow Man and see him as your enemy, so that by the time you face him with crossed swords at the end of the game, you really want to get this guy because he's set you back so many times. It's a way to build an emotional relationship between the player and an opponent through the actual gameplay, rather than just telling it in a cinematic. Hi, I'm Jordan Mechner, creator of Prince of Persia. This is how I animated myself into a corner and had to fight my way out. So I was a kid in New York in the mid-70s. I was into comics, I loved movies. I grew up on Mad Magazine, and if computers hadn't come along when they did, I might have ended up doing comics, animation. But when the Apple II came in 1978, I saw this as a machine that I could, first of all, use to play games at home, which was never possible before. Instead of taking rolls of quarters down to the local arcade, I could stay at home and play Space Invaders on the Apple II as much as I wanted. The computer was also a way that I could make my own games, and I became fascinated with that. This is before the internet, so pretty much everybody was self-taught. I subscribed to Creative Computing magazine, and then a little later Soft Talk magazine, which had articles about how to program, and then I would trade tips with my friends who were also into computers. So my first games were copies of existing arcade games, and you always had 3 lives, and the goal was to get a high score. By now I was a freshman in college, and I wanted to do a game that would tell a story. So that's when I started programming the game that would become Karateka. It was a very simple story. The princess has been kidnapped by the evil warlord who's taken her to his castle. And so as the hero, you have to fight a series of karate battles with the warriors who are guarding the fortress. So you're basically running from left to right. You fight one warrior after another until you reach the end, and then you fight the big bad guy and rescue the princess. So the computer that I was working on was the Apple II. And at that time, the Apple was actually the #1 game platform. But it had limitations. The Apple II's music capabilities weren't that great. It only had 4 colors. The screen was 280 by 192 pixels. And everything had to fit into 48K of memory. That was pretty much a hard limit. In those days, this was before Photoshop. This was before we had graphics and animation tools. If you wanted to put a character up on the screen, you pretty much had to do it pixel by pixel. So when I tried to do the animation for the character, I found out pretty quickly that it just looked stiff and it didn't have the lifelike quality that I was imagining in my head. So I used a technique called rotoscoping, which actually has a long history. It goes back to the early days of film animation. Early Disney animators used filmed footage as reference for the animation in the early films. If you look at Snow White, the human characters like Snow White and the Prince were actually animated using rotoscoping, which means that the Disney animators filmed live actors doing the moves that they needed to animate on screen, and then they would actually project these frames and copy or trace them frame by frame to create the animation that we've seen. So I did that for Karateka. I used Super 8 film to film my karate teacher doing the kicks and punches and the movements that I needed the character to do on screen. And then I traced each Super 8 film frame with tracing paper and pencil, and then translated those into pixels to get it up on the screen. That was kind of the rotoscope 1.0. Karateka came out in 1984, and it became a #1 bestseller. So this was really lucky for me that it happened when it did, because as I graduated from college, instead of going out and getting a job, I actually had the luxury of thinking, what do I want to do next? And I had an idea to do another game. One of the inspirations was the first 10 minutes of the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark. If you remember, Indiana Jones in the opening sequence runs, jumps over a pit, almost misses, spikes spring out of the wall, there's a gate that's closing. And to me, those actions kind of matched what I was seeing in platform games like Lode Runner and the Castles of Dr. Creep, where you'd step on a pressure plate, it would open a gate. I thought, what if we combine that gameplay with a character who's so human feeling that you feel like if you miss the jump and you fall, it's really going to hurt? Because in the early platform games, characters were kind of weightless. You would jump and you would make it or not, but you would float down to the bottom. It didn't feel like you could really get hurt. So my idea was to kind of combine the basic platform puzzle-type gameplay in a sort of a modular environment with very smooth, visceral running and jumping animation that would capture the excitement of the opening minutes of Raiders of the Lost Ark. The story of Prince of Persia was also simple. Like Karateka, it involved rescuing a princess. And it was really inspired by The 1001 Nights and by movies like the 1940 Thief of Baghdad, in which an evil Grand Vizier has seized power and imprisoned the princess. For Prince of Persia, I knew I was going to need so much more animation. Running, jumping, climbing, falling, all the movements that the little character would have to do on screen. And by the time I did the animation for Prince of Persia in '85, a new technology had come along, VHS. So using one of the early VHS cameras, I videotaped my brother running and jumping and doing all those things in the parking lot across the street from our high school.
Go. Jump. Action. Stop. Get up, get up, get up.
And then the problem was how to get these videotaped frames into the computer. After a bit of trial and error, the technique that I finally settled on for Prince of Persia was a kind of analog to digital to analog to digital. It involved several steps. I took the videotape of my brother and put that on a TV screen in a darkened room, put a 35mm film camera on a tripod, aimed it at the TV screen, and then took a picture. Did a frame advance on the VCR, took another picture. Frame advance, frame advance, frame advance. Then I took that roll of film containing about 35 frames down to the local photomat, the 1-hour photo, had the film developed, and then got back a sheaf of snapshots, which I then scotch taped together and using a Sharpie and whiteout, highlighted the outlines of each character, then put that on a Xerox machine and came out with one clean sheet of paper with a series of frames of a clean white character against a black background. So that contrast was sharp enough that I could then put that piece of paper on an animation stand, pointed a video camera at it, and ran that into the Apple II, which had no video in. This was a special digitizer card that could get one clean still image. It couldn't capture motion. But once I had that sheet of 9 or 12 individual frames of the character, I could then go in pixel by pixel and cut them out on screen using my animation tool, and then run those frames in sequence. And so all of this took weeks of work to get from that videotape run or jump to the point where the game was actually playing back those frames in sequence on screen. When I first saw that character running and jumping on the screen, it had that rough illusion of life and of weight. But these were the days of 8-bit graphics. Each frame of animation in Prince of Persia was a series of bytes that represented a fixed image on the screen. And then the next frame of animation was another set of bytes. So to do something like jump in place took 12 frames. To do a running jump might take 15 frames. And the number of frames made the animation smoother. So once you add the jumping, the running, the turning, the hanging, the swinging, all of these things, each individual movement took memory. This is where one difference between computers then and now became very important, because the Apple II's memory was 48K. That's less than a normal text email. So that had to contain everything. All of the images, all of the backgrounds, all of the frames of animation, all of the logic to make it work, all of the sound effects, all of the music, everything. So with all the basic animations that the character needed to navigate through the dungeon, that had filled up all of the computer's available memory. So it was June of 1988, and I was 2 years into making Prince of Persia, and at this point I'd done most of the heavy lifting to get the game working. I had a smoothly animated character that was running through these dungeons, climbing and falling and stepping on pressure plates to open gates and jumping over pits, almost falling on spikes. Everybody who saw the game oohed and ahed. It was like a great proof of concept, but it wasn't that much fun to play. And I kind of had this sinking feeling as I realized, like, I've done almost everything I meant to do, but it just doesn't have that excitement that I was hoping for. Also, there was a ticking clock, which is that the Apple II platform was dying. When I started to make Prince of Persia, the Apple II was still the #1 games platform. By 1988, there were new machines that were coming out that had more colors, higher resolution, better sound capability, and I was really at the tail end of the Apple II's life cycle, but I felt that switching to a different platform would have been like starting over. So the worry was that I could come out with a game that was great, that was fun, but nobody would ever play it. You know, it's always a problem when you reach a point in development that makes you question your initial vision. Sometimes the answer is to say, you know, just believe in the initial vision execute it, it's going to be fine. But sometimes you discover things along the way that make you realize that the initial vision is just a first draft. From the beginning, I had the idea that the main character would not fight, that this was a non-violent character just trying to survive in a dungeon, in a violent world. That is, there are spikes that spring out of the floor, there's gates and falling blocks that can crush you. But this is not a violent character. The point is just to get through these traps and get to the end and rescue the princess. And I had used all of the resources that the Apple II offered to try to create this. I didn't have room to put in another character. So I was sharing an office with friends who were also working on their own projects. Robert Cook was working on a game that became Degeneration. Tommy Pierce was creating educational software. And every time Tommy saw Prince of Persia on my screen as she walked by my desk, she would say, "Combat, combat, combat. You need combat or this game's not going to be fun." And this frustrated me because I hadn't planned for combat. Karateka was a fighting game. The whole game was you meet a guard, you fight the guard, and then on to the next battle. And so I would explain to Tommy, I can't do that because there's not enough memory in the computer to also have a smoothly animated enemy that does everything that I would need an enemy to do. But when Tommy got an idea, she wouldn't let it go. And so I would add a new feature to the game. I'd say, okay, now there's torches on the wall. Now I've got jaw traps that chomp and add suspense. Isn't it better now? Tommy would look at the new feature I'd added and say, combat, combat, combat. And with frustration, I realized that there was something to what she was saying. As much as I wished that it was almost done, it just wasn't that much fun. So this was the problem. 2 years into development, I'd used up all the memory to get as far as I'd gotten, but the game was missing that suspense and excitement and sense of conflict that had made Karateka so simple and so much fun. What was I going to do? So I can tell you exactly what happened on that day in June 1988 because I wrote about it in my journal. It was another day in which Tommy had come and looked at my screen and said, "Combat, you need combat." And again, I'd rolled out my usual argument about how, first of all, that's not the concept of the game. Second of all, there's no memory. And she said, "Well, in Karateka, you used the same shapes for the hero and the enemy. Couldn't you do that?" I said, "No, because the hero looks like a likable, endearing kind of character. The enemy shouldn't look like that." And she said, "Well, what if you made them enemies a different color?" And then the idea came to me, what if I exclusive OR'd each byte with itself shifted 1 bit over? So the Apple II didn't have image processing in any kind of sense that we understand it now, because the graphics were all bitmapped. But one of the assembly language instructions was called exclusive OR, which basically means if the 2 bits are the same, you get a 0. If the 2 bits are different, you get a 1. So as I was telling Tommy for the 10th time why I couldn't draw a character in a different color than the one I'd originally created, I realized that if I used the exclusive OR instruction, shifted 1 bit over, this would create a kind of a shimmery, ghostly outline of the main character. And as soon as I said those words, the character's name popped into being, Shadow Man. So with Tommy and Robert looking over my shoulder, it actually took me all of 5 minutes to write the code that would turn the main character into a shimmery, ghostly version of itself. And as soon as we saw Shadow Man running, jumping, and climbing through the dungeon, it became obvious that this was the opponent that the game needed. It was Robert who suggested that Shadow Man could come into being when you jump through a mirror. Your ghostly self jumps out the other direction, and then once it's loose in the dungeons, becomes your enemy, stealing potions, closing gates that you wanted open, and just kind of wreaking all kind of havoc. So out of necessity was born this character who ended up becoming one of the best features of the game. It's a case of where constraints can sometimes push you to more creative solutions than you would have found in the beginning if they had been available. If memory had not been a constraint, I probably would have created all kinds of monsters and enemies in Prince of Persia to add a lot of variety. But because there was no room for any of that, I was forced to dig deeper and came up with Shadow Man, which ended up actually being kind of deeper and more satisfying. At the end of the game, when you confront your shadow self and you fight him with swords, every time you hit Shadow Man, you lose a strength point, and you realize that if you keep fighting, you're eventually going to kill yourself. So the solution is not to win the sword fight, but to put away your sword. And when you put away the sword, Shadow Man does the same. And then facing each other, you run towards Shadow Man, he runs towards you, and the two of you merge and are reunited. And then you get back all the health points that Shadow Man had stolen from you throughout the game. And with this restored strength and wholeness, you're then able to fight the Grand Vizier and win the game. That's something that I wouldn't have come up with if I didn't have to. Once Shadow Man was in the game, it was obvious that that was the right way to go. And so I managed to squeeze out of the memory enough frames to do sword fighting so that you could fight the shadow version of yourself. And that was so compelling that I said, all right, whatever it takes, I've got to find a way to populate this dungeon with guards. And at this late stage, I found a way to take 12K of memory that was hiding in the auxiliary memory card of the Apple II to add a guard. But this presented a new problem. How did we create the animation for the enemies? So the model for the animations in Prince of Persia had been my younger brother, who at this point was 3,000 miles away, and he wasn't any good at sword fighting anyway. So my first attempt was to film myself and my office mate Robert with a sword doing fencing. Unfortunately, that didn't work. Finally, in desperation, I turned to one of my favorite films, the 1938 Robin Hood with Errol Flynn. And it just happened that in this film, in his climactic duel with Basil Rathbone, there's a sequence of about 6 seconds where the two characters are perfectly in profile, fighting each other. So with a VHS tape of the 1938 Robin Hood, I took photographs of each frame of film and extracted the moves that the characters would need to do in order to do sword fighting. And once the guards were in there, the game felt complete. Now, as you moved through the dungeons, you had that feeling of challenge, of suspense, of fear that had been such an important part of what made Karateka successful. The lesson, if there is one, the best way that I've been able to formulate it is that when you have these two voices, two different approaches in your brain, giving you two different solutions that are diametrically opposed, to really try to tune in to each voice and think, is this the voice of the big picture? Because sometimes you can have great ideas that are kind of taking you off the path of what you originally set out to do. But sometimes that voice is actually putting you back on the path. The reason that Shadow Man was the right thing to do, I think, goes back to the original inspiration of Prince of Persia. It's basically the modern version of a swashbuckling movie. And in those old swashbuckling movies, whether it was Errol Flynn or Douglas Fairbanks or Indiana Jones, the hero did fight. So it's completely in line with that spirit. Prince of Persia released at the end of 1989 on the Apple II, and as I'd feared, I'd lost the race against time. By then the Apple II was a dying platform, and for about a year, I had the agonizing experience of feeling that this game that I'd worked so hard on, which everybody who played was enjoying, but this game was going to sink without a trace. What saved it was the ports to other platforms, to the PC, to the Mac, and also to consoles like Sega and Nintendo that came out over the next couple of years and kind of rescued this game that had been a flop and made it into a hit. And that's what actually made it really clear to me that adding Shadow Man and combat had been the right thing to do, because on these other platforms, the memory issues that had been so critical on the Apple II no longer existed. Those swashbuckling cinematic roots turned out to be a key part of what made Prince of Persia what it is. Prince of Persia was successful enough on PC that we did a sequel, Prince of Persia 2, The Shadow and the Flame. And by the time this game came out in 1993, we had a new generation of PCs that could do sound and music and color graphics way beyond what was possible in the late 80s. And we took advantage of this, adding more enemies, more characters, and richer environments, sending the prince on a journey across a world that got us out of the dungeon and palace of Prince of Persia 1. But the basic gameplay, the formula of traps, fight and flight, puzzle solving, and combat and exploration was still pretty close to what it had been in Prince of Persia 1. Since the original Prince of Persia, the technology has advanced, but the basic questions of game design haven't really changed all that much. When we did the remake in 2003, Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time, we were working on a much later generation of console, the PlayStation 2 generation. And so for the first time we had 3D graphics, the ability to rewind time, sound, music, all these things that the Apple II couldn't do. But we still had constraints. The first draft of the story for The Sands of Time had been much more complicated, with kind of a political intrigue and different factions within the kingdom. So for the final game, we ended up stripping all of that out and going with a much simpler story in which everybody in the kingdom has been transformed into sand monsters. And that one decision made it possible to design a game that was actually in sync with what you could do with a controller in your hands, because everybody that you met was a sand monster. So your only options really were acrobatics, combat, and running away. And that was a good fit with what you could do as a player. Even though we had the ability to do dialogue and facial animations and so forth, having a large cast of characters would have taken the game away from its strengths. So in designing a game story, you really want to find choices that emphasize the strengths rather than emphasizing the weaknesses. This year is the 30th anniversary of the original Prince of Persia, and a lot of what I've told you today, I remember thanks to the fact that I kept a journal. So we're actually re-releasing these journals as a book for Prince of Persia's 30th anniversary. They're the journals that I kept at the time as I was making the game, so it's got the roller coaster of all the ups and downs of this game is going to be great, this game is going to be a disaster, and how do I solve this particular problem? We've also illustrated the journals with screenshots of the work in progress and sketches. So it's been a lot of fun for me on this anniversary to have a reason to go back and look at those old journals again, which, being in the 80s are, mostly on pen and paper.